Hi Tana. Gonna show you some basics on crochet, so bear with me here. Got my yarn. This is the same yarn that I gave to you, and you should also have a hook that says 4.5 millimeters. It's kind of like a greenish tealish color. I don't know if that's gonna read well on this. Sorry for any background noise. You know as well as I do that when you've got a family, nothing stops. So we're gonna start by making a magic circle or a magic loop. I'm gonna take 2 fingers, put it underneath my yarn, wrap the yarn around, and then flip my fingers, and across the top I'm gonna lay it over. So I've got this kind of X here over the top of my fingers. So I'm gonna take the tip of my hook, I'm gonna slide it underneath the first one, kind of above my middle finger, over the second one, and I'm gonna snag that with my hook and pull it underneath the original. So this is where it might get a little slippery. Just take your time with it. We're going to take the working yarn, which is the yarn that's attached to the ball, wrap it around the hook. This is called yarning over, and then pull it through that loop that we just made. And now this circle, this like loop here, we're going to work into this loop. So now that we have this loop, I'm just going to pull out a bit of yarn. When you're holding your yarn, people will tension their yarn differently. For me, I just kind of like lay it over 3 fingers around the pointer and kind of grab it here. And then that way I can use either my middle finger or my thumb to maneuver it if I need to. And I can use those 2 fingers to hold my work as well. So from here, I'm going to do something called a chain. Now I have this little loop and a loop on my hook. I'm going to yarn over. So I'm going to take this and wrap it around the head of my hook and pull it through the loop, and that's called a chain. Now from here, I'm going to do something called a double crochet. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to yarn over. Instead of pulling it through this loop, I'm going to take my hook and go into my magic loop, right around that the tail, yarn over again, and now you'll, whoops, this is called pulling up a loop, and now I have 3 loops on my hook. I'm going to yarn over one more time. I'm going to pull through 1, 2 of the 3 loops on my hook. Oops. This yarn can be a bit splitty, so take your time with it. And now I have 2 loops. I'm going to yarn over again and pull through the other 2. That's called a double crochet. I'm going to do a few of these now. My first initial chain right here, I'm going to count that as 1 double crochet. So I'm going to do 1 more double crochet. So yarning over, putting through my magic circle to pull up a loop, yarning over, pulling through 1 and 2, yarning over, pulling through 1 and 2. Now I have 3 stitches here, and this is going to be called a cluster. We're going to be doing a kind of granny square. I'm going to chain 2, so just yarning over and pulling through twice. That's going to create my corner. Now I'm going to double crochet another cluster. Yarning over, going through the loop, the magic circle I mean, pulling up a loop, yarning over, pulling through 2, yarning over, pulling through 2. And again, yarning over, through the loop, pull up, yarn over, pull through 2, yarning over, and pulling through 2. And one more time for this cluster. So that cluster is complete. We're going to do a total of 4 of these clusters. So I have 1, 2. Now I'm going to chain 2. 1, 2. And another cluster of 3 double crochets. Take your time with this. It doesn't have to be fast. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be neat. Something that you'll hear a lot if you start to kind of poke around in the crochet world are words like tension, and that is basically how tightly you keep, pulling on your working yarn. You'll get a feel for this the more you go. It's not something you have to have a handle on right now. So if your work looks a little different than mine, don't panic. So we're going to do 1, 2 chains and our last 3 double crochet cluster. 1, 2. 1, 2. And 1, 2. So I've got my 4 clusters. I need 1 more chain 2. And now I'm going to do what is called connecting in the round. And I'm going to do that by taking this tail, so the end of our yarn, and if I pull it and hold on to those double crochets, it starts to close up that loop. And I just pull it a little bit, not super tight, to get my stuff closer together. And then I'm going to find the top stitch from that chain that I made at the very beginning. So if you're looking here, you can see this is my very first yarn over into my magic circle. This is the chain 1 that I made, and this is the stitch that belongs to my first double crochet. So I'm going to go into this stitch at the top of that double crochet, yarn over, and I'm going to do what's called a slip stitch. So rather than yarning over, which would create a crochet stitch, I'm just going to pull this straight through. Alright, so now I'm going to, again, take this tail on the back and pull it, and I'm going to close up this hole in the center. We'll weave in this end later, and I'll show you how I do that, but for right now, this is kind of where we're at. Alright, so we have our completed round. From here, what I'm going to do to get over to this chain space, because that's where I'm going to start my next granny cluster, is I'm going to slip stitch, yarning over and pulling through, and then I'm going to slip stitch into this chain space here. And that's just going to get me over to this corner. From here, I'm going to chain 1 and 2. This will be my first double crochet in this cluster. I'm going to do 1 granny cluster, so a total of 3. Whoops. And then with the granny squares, you're going to increase at your corners. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to chain 1 and 2, and then do another granny cluster in this same chain 2 space. So again, yarn over into your chain space. You'll notice here the top of this stitch is kind of open. Don't go into there. That's not your chain 2 space. That's the top of your first double crochet. So make sure you're going into the space here. Yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2. So we're going to complete this cluster. And if we look at it now, we can kind of see that corner where this belongs to this side and this belongs to this side. Now we're going to go over here. Rather than slip stitching over like we did for that first section, since we were, you know, at the end of a round, we're just going to chain 1. And I'm only going to chain 1 here because on our next round, I don't need to increase here, so I don't need quite as much space. So now, after I do that chain 1, I'm going to find my next corner, my next chain space, and I'm going to do a granny cluster. All right, now I'm going to create my chain 2 space for my next corner. 1, 2, and another granny cluster. I'm just kind of pulling this to the side here. This yarn that I gave you is 100% acrylic, so it's pretty sturdy stuff. You're not likely to be able to just pull and break it, so don't worry if you're kind of holding it tight or, you know, having to yank a little. It's not going to be that big of a problem. And again, the more you do this, the easier and more natural it's going to be. So now that I have that corner done, I'm going to chain 1 and start my next corner. There we go, that corner is complete. Again, we're going to chain 1. And 3. Okay, so now our round is almost complete. We're just going to connect our 2 sides by chaining 1. And again, we're going to look at this, you know, this chain that we made right here. We have our 1, 2, and then the stitch at the top of that cluster going underneath both loops of that stitch at the top of that double crochet, pulling up a loop and just pulling it right through. And that's going to complete our second round. Now from here, oftentimes with granny patterns, you will see color changes kind of throughout. So I'm going to show you how to do a color change. And the way that I'm going to do that, I'm just going to make this, pull this way out. You want to leave yourself a good, oh, I usually do about 3 inches or so, 3 to 4 inches of a tail. And I'm just going to snip that. Doop. And I can pull the yarn out. I'll show you how to weave in these ends real soon. Let me go get another ball of yarn and we'll do a color change. Alright, so I got another ball of yarn. Just a little pro tip, if you have little barrettes. It's a great way to secure the ends of your yarn on your balls of yarn. So you literally just wrap it up and then clip it down. And I'm going to set that to the side now. Now I have this kind of bluish, purplish, pinkish color that I'm going to use. I'm going to pick up my granny square, oops, and just kind of pick a corner. I usually try to move away from this one so that I don't have a lot of ends to weave in right at the same spot. It can get a little bit bulky if you have to go over the same spot a bunch of times. So I'm going to hold my yarn, my new yarn, behind my project. With granny squares, there's not usually like a very distinct front and back, but usually whatever's up is going to be your front. So I'm just going to hold this behind my work and pick a corner. Now I'm going to take my hook, put it through my corner, my little chain space, and I'm going to grab that yarn with my hook and pull up a loop. Now when I do this, I try to get it, I take my tail and I pull it kind of over my working yarn. Sorry, can't really see that. So it almost wraps around it. That way when I grab my working yarn to yarn over and pull through, it secures my tail. It's not tied necessarily, but it is going to keep it a little bit more secure when you're working your next stitch. So I'm going to chain 1, and that's going to create my chain 2, which will be my first double crochet, my first cluster. And when I go back into this loop, I'm going to look for my tail and make sure that that's, getting caught in this little yarn over as well. And again, this is just going to help secure that. And I'm going to do my double crochet and one more double crochet in that same space to create my first granny cluster. And from here, we work it pretty much the same as the previous rounds, where we're going to do 2 granny clusters in each of the corners. The difference here is that in each chain 1 space along the side, we're also going to work a granny cluster. So we're increasing the number of clusters each round. I'm going to chain 2 and do my second cluster for this corner. That corner is complete. Now I'm going to chain 1 because this is not going to be a corner, this is the side. And I'm not going to stitch over this tail anymore because I don't want it to run across this and be seen on my granny square. So I'm just going to leave that behind. And I'm going to start my granny cluster into this single chain space. And then from there, I'm going to chain 1, because again, this is not a corner, and do 2 granny clusters in this corner. And second granny cluster. Now I'm going to pause the recording and just complete this round, and I will come back when I'm going to slip stitch to complete the round. Okay, so I said I would see you at the end of the round, but I've just come around to the tail for my first color, and I thought that I should probably mention that in this chain space here, when I'm creating my granny cluster, I'm going to make sure that I'm catching that tail with my yarn overs, similarly to the beginning of this color, just to help make it a little bit more secure. And it'll also help, you know, this space to not like stretch out and unravel as you continue working your granny square. Just to kind of like tide you over till you weave in your ends, which is what we will do once I make it to the corner. All right, so we are at the end of our round. Again, I'm going to look at my 1, 2, and slip stitch into the top of that first double crochet to complete my round. Since I'm not going to be doing another color, I'm just going to do a chain 1 to help kind of secure this spot here. And I'm going to pull out my yarn a bit and snip it. Maybe. There we go. Pulling it off to the side just to kind of pull that in. Now, I have an almost completed granny square. It's pretty small. You can add more rounds. You can use chunkier yarn. This is kind of a medium, a standard, like worsted weight is one term that is used. Also size 4. You'll see on labels for yarn different numbers for weights, and that will tell you how thick the yarn is. You'll often also see phrases like 2-ply or 4-ply, and what that tells you is how many strands of yarn are kind of put together. So this yarn has 6 strands, so this would be a 6-ply yarn. So 6 strands of yarn are spun together to create this yarn. So this is one tool that I didn't provide you with, tapestry needles. Now I just picked these up at Joann's. I think they were on sale, or maybe I had a coupon because I never buy anything full price from Joann's. But you might have these on hand. The difference between these and a typical sewing needle is just kind of the hoop or the loop at the end tends to be a little bit wider. So a little bit easier for these thicker yarns to go through. This one has a pretty blunt end. You can get them sharper, and I would honestly suggest using a sharper one just because it's going to let you really pierce through the like stitches to get a nice secure weave. I'm going to start with my center tail. We'll see how this goes. I kind of suck at this part, so we'll see. I kind of just keep pulling until all of them come through, and then clean it up a little bit. Make sure that all of my strands of yarn are through my loop. Now, I'm just going to give this a nice pull and really close up that center hole. You can see nothing behind it. I'm going to first go in the same direction. My tail already wants to go around the same like loop. You're just going to kind of tuck it into the stitches. You don't want to go all the way through the other side because you don't want it to show through. But I usually do one round in the same direction. And then one round in the opposite direction. And the reason I do this with the loops is because if this is anything that you intend to wash, whether it be hand wash or in a washing machine, if there's one part of your crochet that's going to come apart, it's going to be your magic circle. It tends to just kind of be a bit of a weak point. And while I'm going, I'm just going to stretch this out so that you're not like scrunching up those stitches any more than they already are. For the centerpiece, that's not too much of a problem because you're literally, I mean, you're kind of trying to close the hole. But it's just a best practice thing to do it whenever you can. Just give it a little bit of space so it's flat rather than like puffed up. So I've gone around one direction and then the other direction. And now I'm actually just going to feed this up into one of my double crochets. And I'm going to be piercing through the yarn where I can. Again, I'm not going to go through the other side. If you see, you can't see my needle in that stitch, which is good because that means that I have not pierced through the other side. And once I have it in one of the stitches and away from that center, I'm going to trim it. And the way that I do this, I'm actually going to pull it a little bit extra so that that does scrunch up. I know, a little counterintuitive to what I just said. But then when I snip it close and I stretch that stitch back out, it tucks the end of that tail into the stitch. So it's not going to like grab on something and end up pulling out. And just working chronologically through my tails, I'll do this one next. When you have tails at color changes, you don't really have a loop to go around, but you do want to make sure that you're going in multiple directions. Like, you don't want to just go straight and call it a day. Because again, the whole point of weaving in your ends is to make them secure. So I'm going to pierce through these couple of stitches that you can see in this more orangey pink color, and then I'm going to go under and through this corner one. And then rather than continuing around this direction, I'm going to go backwards and then down through this double crochet on the opposite side of that granny cluster where it started. And again, I'm going to make sure that I'm continually pulling this as I'm doing these stitches to make sure that I'm not bunching anything up where I don't want it to be bunched up. And now I'll just kind of throw this in along here. You want to go a number of different directions. Wherever you think you can get a nice hidden tail, power to you. You know, it's a lot easier with some of these like variegated colors, which means like you have a lot of different colors together, because it's a little bit easier to hide when there isn't a kind of a regular pattern to be following. So again, I'm going to pull this a little bit extra tight, snip it close, and then flatten it out to kind of tuck that tail in. And two more ends. I'm just going to do these real quick off camera. One note before I do that though, is that with these color changes, I'm not going to take this pink purple through this orange, because that is going to potentially stand out more. You know, it's not a big deal if I make it, you know, really hidden in those stitches, but if any shows through, it will be a lot more noticeable than if I do it up into this granny cluster and across here and then down and over and back up. And yeah, so just kind of try to weave in colors with colors, if that makes sense. Alright, so I've just snipped my last end, and the last step to a project like this, at least as far as like this first, just making the square goes, is something called blocking. And personally, I don't really block my stuff just because I'm a little lazy. With certain types of yarn, it's really important, like wool or like an animal fiber. Those are really important to block. Sometimes cotton can be important to block because you, especially if you're doing like a wearable, you'll want to know if it's going to shrink or not. And that's kind of a different part of the process that we can get into in another video. Blocking, I'm not going to show you how to do, mostly because I don't do it. If the shape of yours is really wonky, like it's really like cocked off to the side, that's when I would suggest blocking. That's just not typically something that I have to worry about. And over time, you'll get a little bit better with your tension and you'll end up with like neater end pieces anyways. So that's your first granny square. If you want to use multiple colors, or if you want to make it larger, you know, you can do a lot with granny squares, like, and even just using chains, slip stitches, and double crochets. You know, we learned the magic loop. If you have any questions about it, leave a comment, or you can just call me or text me and ask for something more specific or clarification. So yeah.